All our lives, we've been told that economics is boring. A huge number of people believe as if they don't need to spend time understanding the economy. And yet, war, poverty, protests, they all depend on the economy. The foundation of the economy also depends upon the key asset that lies at its core: money. It has been compared to the water of life. We use money almost every day and it's central to modern life. We're trying to earn it. Sometimes we worry about being broke. Sometimes we look for ways to turn money into the most profitable investment. Money even plays a role in determining our social status in society. Wars have been fought. We have to return to its historical roots to understand the Fed better. So let's go back to December 23, 1913, about a century from today. The Federal Reserve Law was signed at the White House. The law bears the signature of Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States of America. The newspapers of the period carried out this news in their headlines with great enthusiasm.
What is the Federal Reserve and what is your answer?
Well, what it is, it's a cartel. It's not a government agency. It has the appearance of it being a government agency, and they went to great lengths to give it that facade. It does have the power of government because Congress voted to give the power of enforcement to it. But in its essence, underneath it, it's a cartel.
But the actually decisive meeting was held on a secret trip train before the meeting at the White House. In the 1900s, the Morgan, Warburg, Rockefeller, and Rothschild families were the world's largest bankers. They had one goal. They wanted to bring back the central bank system, and yet the law prevented this. The money barons had a dirty plan. The operation was initiated by fake news. JP Morgan was the one who pushed the button. He was the most powerful banker in New York. He spread the rumor that a big bank was going down. Fear that it would go bankrupt led other major banks to pump money into it. In 1907, this panic that lit the fuse on Wall Street took its toll. Everyone was running to the banks, withdrawing their money. In the crisis that grew with the public attacking the banks came to the brink of bankruptcy. There was no central bank to borrow from. Senator Nelson Aldrich, an influential figure of this era, who these bankers had purchased for their purposes, lobbied for the central bank. This dirty plan soon came to fruition. On the night of the Christmas break, the law was passed without anyone knowing. November 22, 1910. On a cold day, a train at the Hoboken, New Jersey railway station was about to embark on a historic journey. The select group of bankers, riding in a special wagon, closed all the curtains and locked the doors. The luxury wagon belonged to the Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich. Many have called him the most influential figure of the era. Aldrich was criticized for his close ties to wealthy bankers such as J.P. Morgan and his daughter's marriage to John D. Rockefeller Jr. On this historic trip, Aldrich was accompanied by Deputy Treasury Secretary A.P. Andrew, Rockefeller's representative Frank Vanderlip, and J.P. Morgan partners Henry Davidson and Benjamin Strong. The train left the station, leaving journalists curious to find out where they were going. Arriving at the deserted Brunswick station, the group boarded a ship from there to Jekyll Island. A number of powerful families met on Jekyll Island and set the Federal Reserve law.
The funny thing about that piece of history is that the Federal Reserve bill was being sold to the American people at that time as a piece of legislation that was going to somehow control those big bad bankers. See? And what they didn't realize is that the big bad bankers that you're looking at right there, those are the epitome of the great power centers of banking. They were the ones that were busy writing the bill.
The details of that top secret meeting were never known, but the bankers' decisions were implemented one by one. U.S. Congressman Louis McFadden noticed this dirty and undemocratic incident and spoke out against it. The world banking system is being established, a hub controlled by global bankers. They enslave the world for their passions. The state is being usurped by the federal bank, he warned. But not long after that, he died of food poisoning. Paul Moritz Warburg avoided using the central bank definition. He specifically chose the name Federal Reserve System so the public would think it was a government agency. Yet the Fed is neither a government agency nor a reserve of money for difficult situations kept on the sidelines for the public good. Just as the Fed is dominating the US economy, it is also seriously steering the world economy.
All looks lifeless. But underneath the rubble, there are people living in the cellars. The smoke from the cooking stoves drifts up from the ruins to the open third story where people are living too. Many in the big towns living without light, without coal, without water, without soap, living in the stench of corpses and sewerage, but still with the will to live.
Fast forward to the end of the Second World War. Continental Europe and its economy were razed to the ground. The United States is the greatest power on the capitalist side. The Allies meet in the United States in the summer of 1944. The IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization were established at a conference attended by 44 countries in Bretton Woods. The foundations of the new system were rapidly being laid. Central banks around the world have held dollars as reserves alongside gold. Each country preferred dollars as much as their own country's money, sometimes even more than their own currency.
I don't believe it will change a lot in such a little time. If you talk about 30, 40 years, then who knows? If you're talking about 10 years, I think that it won't change very much. The dollar will still be the most important international currency just for one reason, which is that the US economy will still be the biggest economy in the world.
The pricing of critical commodities, specifically oil and gold, in dollars has strengthened the dollar's empire. It has strengthened the hegemonic power of the United States globally, and especially in the Gulf. Yet the protracted Vietnam War in the 1960s had broken America's back and its role as the #1 economy. In 1971, the US abandoned the principle of printing the dollars as equivalent of gold.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
By a historic order from President Richard Nixon, all the banknotes in the world were free. However, even after the gold currency standard was removed, the dollar continued to be accepted as if it was the gold currency.
The euro is an example to the rest of the world, Latin American nations in particular, struggling with the issue of monetary stability. And one way to solve it as this very nettlesome and important issue. So I would expect that from a global perspective, we have stable prices in Europe, stable prices in the United States with the dollar. The prospects of a stable international monetary system are the best they've been since Bretton Woods collapsed in 1971.
Some would hide part of their money by turning it into dollars. This is called currency substitution or dollarization. The dollar, with the strength it had inherited from its past, is still the favorite currency in most central banks' reserves. A high dollarization preference by weak economies and the high demand of central banks for dollars support the dollar and maintain it as a world currency.
Dünya ekonomisinde özellikle 29-30 buhranı sonrası Fed'in ortaya çıkması öncesi ve sonrasında Fed'in güçlenmesi ve Bretton Woods anlaşmasından da çıkılmasıyla birlikte doların petrolü de kullanarak petrodolar diyoruz. Rezerv para haline gelmesi Amerika'nın askeri ve siyasal gücü dışında ekonomik gücünü de dolar üzerinden kullanmasına sebep oldu.
Overshadowed by all these developments, an anti-dollar front is growing rapidly. Many national leaders, uncomfortable with the dollar's extreme volatility, want to break the dollar's hegemony by trading in local currency. These countries are uncomfortable with the fact that the United States can impose sanctions using the dollar at any time and carry out any operation it wants against their economies. Turkey's use of the national currency in trade with Russia, China, Iran, and African countries is on the agenda.
Artık tüm Afrikalı dostlarıma, kardeşlerime söylüyorum. Yerli para, milli parayla gelin ortak iş yapalım diyor.
Following Erdogan's call, Turkey's exports using its national currency are rising rapidly.
Yeni dönemde Türkiye olarak biz ticaret hacmi noktasında yerel paralar ve swaplar noktasında çok daha etkin bir şekilde yöneteceğimiz bir süreç ve bu da beraberinde özellikle 2020'nin ikinci yarısı İnşallah her anlamda önemli kazanımları elde edeceğimiz bir ikinci yarı olur.
Yerli paralarla ihracatımızı da teşvik ediyoruz. Bu konuda çalıştaylar düzenliyoruz tüm paydaşlarımızla beraber. Ekim ayında TL ile ihracatımız 9,8 milyar TL'ye ulaşmış bulunmaktadır.
The coronavirus outbreak has dealt an unprecedented blow to the world's economy. The International Monetary Fund has sharply lowered its forecast for global growth this year. The IMF is now predicting much more serious economic damage. The fund predicts the global economy will shrink by 4.9% this year.
The COVID-19 pandemic pushed economies into a great lockdown that saved lives but also triggered the worst recession since the Great Depression.
Today, as the world descends into great chaos, the United States has added $3 trillion in additional national debt in just 3 years. So who does the United States really owe this money to? On paper, it looks like countries are actually borrowing to boost the assets of their companies. Rather, the US owes money to the Rothschild family in London because 12 London-based asset management companies manage exactly $104 trillion.
But what am I doing? I'm fighting the deep state. I'm fighting the swamp. and I said I was doing it, and I'm exposing the swamp. I think if it keeps going the way I'm going, and Ratcliffe is fantastic, if it keeps going the way it's going, I have a chance to break the deep state.
Is Trump targeting the Fed, the US central bank, with his "I'm draining the swamp" trademark slogan? The definition of the swamp here refers to a book called Draining the Swamp, authored by Harvey Francis Bernard. Bernard is the founder of the NESARA system in the 1990s. NESARA means the National Economic Security and Recovery Act. NESARA's first goal is to get control of the Fed. That's because the Fed is seen as the center of the swamp. The Fed is the only central bank in the world that has the authority to print money for free. It is not clear how many dollars it printed. Senior economic chiefs presented a report that pushed the country out of the coronavirus hurricane by $4.5 trillion, and then Trump intervened in the market with $4 trillion. Already those who follow Trump's social media feeds are seeing him wage war on the Fed.
The Federal Reserve is wrong so often. I see the numbers also, and do much better than they do. We will have very good third quarter, a great fourth quarter, and one of our best ever years in 2021. We will also soon have a vaccine and therapeutics cure.
We don't know how the fight between Trump and the Fed will end, but it is absolutely clear that the war between the two fronts is escalating.
My biggest threat is the Fed, because the Fed is raising rates too fast, and it's independent, so I don't speak to him, but I'm not happy with what he's doing because it's going too fast, because you looked at the last inflation numbers, they're very low.
After the coronavirus crisis ravaged the world, it is clear that the foundation for this economic disaster was laid in 1944. The Bretton Woods system is dead and totally clogged up. It is inevitable that global financial institutions will need to be reviewed and reformed. In these complex times, they are no longer able to supervise the closely connected financial centers.
An area where there was a substantial breakthrough at this conference was the laying out of a roadmap for reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. Recognition that as the world economy has changed, so too these organisations must change.